All right, good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us this morning on our third day of the summit. And this morning we have Anna EldenBrady with us, she will be presenting Queerstory, The Tip of the Iceberg. And Anna is one of the three coordinators for the Michigan 4-H Tech Wizards Youth Mentoring Program. V has been coordinating programming sites in Muskegon County on the shores of Lake Michigan since 2018. And when not enthusiastically diving into STEAM projects with the youth and adults in her program, V happily explores diversity, equity, and inclusion areas and searches for ways to share what V learns with colleagues and community partners. And you can read much more about Anna on our website. And with that, I am going to turn it over to you, Anna.
Well, thank you very much. So hello all, good morning, good afternoon, good day, wherever it is you are in the world and whenever. Welcome to Queerstory The Tip of the Iceberg. I will be your host today on a whirlwind tour of just a sliver of queer history. If you have questions that come up, I won't be able to see the chat while I'm screen sharing, but please do feel free to post comments or questions in there. And if we don't have time to address them at the end, I will create a doc in the resource share Google Drive folder that I'll put the answers on, and then y'all can see that and share it as you need to. This community's history is deep and rich and goes well beyond what I can cover in our short time to get together. I want to acknowledge up front, this is an overview that excludes a lot, including varying perspectives and experiences of the many indigenous nations that were thriving here and in other nations before colonization. But to paint those perspectives with a single stroke and say all indigenous nations believed this about gender and sexuality would do them a huge disservice. I encourage you to find and listen to Native American, First Nations, indigenous voices who have written about their histories, experiences, and perspectives. Now, I've often been asked, why study history? And I think Bruce Ward's quotation on the screen is the perfect answer. History fades if we are not relentless in bearing witness. So first, we're going to fly through a timeline of legal history in the 19th century. 1811, the Netherlands abolished their laws criminalizing homosexual conduct. And while that is the bare minimum, it's more than we tend to hear about that early in modern Western legal history. 2 years later, the Kingdom of Bavaria did the same. And on this side of the pond, well, in 1814, crime against nature, a term that covered everything from bestiality to homosexuality, appeared for the first time in the US legal code. Other nations followed the Netherlands and Kingdom of Bavaria in decriminalizing homosexual practices. Here's a list of those that did throughout the 1870s. Dominican Republic, El Salvador, Empire of Brazil, Bolivia, Hanover, Portugal, Argentina, San Marino, Guatemala, and Mexico. I don't want to give the impression that this means these places were havens of acceptance, but rather that they had the very basic idea that it wasn't a crime for gay people to exist, and jail or execution wasn't a good response to finding out someone's sexuality. The German Empire formed in 1871, and its legal code included paragraph 175, which criminalized homosexuality. Though by the late 1800s, there would be a small but determined gay rights movement within the country alongside a strong women's movement and the greater inclusion of science in German culture. Great Britain made a little progress in the 1880s, deciding death was too severe of a punishment, but it did still keep homosexuality a criminal act. Portugal decided to recriminalize homosexuality in 1886. Progress is never a direct road. Italy and the Vatican joined the decriminalization train in 1890, and it is in this decade that we also get the first use of the words bisexual and heterosexual in English in something akin to their current definition. And in German, the word Homosexualität is first used to describe same-sex attraction. Around the turn of the 19th century in the United States, one of my heroes is also one of the first people in America to openly speak about homosexual rights in the public sphere. Emma Goldman, crowned Most Dangerous Woman in America by J. Edgar Hoover for her radical beliefs, saw no problem with people loving and living with whomever they liked. She arrived in the United States in 1885 at the age of 17 from a village in the Russian Empire, now Lithuania, and found kinship in anarchist circles where she immediately began her work as an agitator and activist. In her 1931 autobiography, she wrote, "I want freedom, the right to self-expression, everybody's right to beautiful, radiant things. Anarchism meant that to me, and I would live it in spite of the whole world. Prisons, persecution, everything. Yes, even in spite of the condemnation of my own closest comrades, I would live my beautiful ideal." But even her fellow anarchists thought her advocacy for homosexuality pushed things a little too far. They distanced themselves from her in this. Anarchists were already seen as dangerous and possibly perverted, so advocating for something that many people also thought was a perversion on top of all that didn't really appeal to them. But Emma was undeterred, stating, "It is a tragedy, I feel, that people of a different sexual type are caught in a world which shows so little understanding for homosexuals and is so crassly indifferent to the various gradations and variations of gender and their great significance in life." Though stripped of her citizenship in 1908, she would remain in the United States until 1919, lecturing and agitating on everything from freedom of speech to labor rights to birth control and free love. Emma's general attitude towards American capitalism and industry at the time was essentially, let the workers burn their exploiters' houses, preferably with them in it. And her work in this area, including her support and participation in violent action, did lead to her deportation. But she was an ally or accomplice to LGBTQ communities before we named people such. Some of the first major work to expand the rights of gender and sexuality minorities took place in Germany in the late 19th century and early 20th century. Magnus Hirschfeld was a gay Jewish man who founded the Scientific Humanitarian Committee, considered one of the world's first organizations set up to advocate for the rights of sexual and gender identity minorities in 1897 in Berlin. It was primarily aimed at repealing paragraph 175 of the German Imperial Penal Code, which punished sexual conduct between men. His work was rooted in his profession as a doctor, one of the few willing to treat gay men. Two things pushed his resolve to alleviate what he called sexual suffering forward. One was the trial and imprisonment of Oscar Wilde. The other was the suicide of one of his patients, a lieutenant who shot himself the day before his wedding, leaving a note saying, "Please could you educate the public on the bad fate for people like me who are not fit for marriage. Please tell the public everything about us." Hirschfeld used his professional influence for advocacy and his skills as a researcher to begin exploring how sexuality was expressed in cultures throughout the world. According to a 2016 article on Hirschfeld in The Guardian, quote, "Hirschfeld's conservative Jewish family were deeply unhappy with his chosen field, pleading with him to specialize in something more respectable, such as cholera. Hirschfeld replied, 'What are you saying, that cholera brings you more joy than sexuality?' End quote. I do want to pause a moment to note that Hirschfeld's beliefs are not without controversy, though. Germany's sex and gender roles were becoming more liberal and censorship rules relaxed for the distribution of print materials at the turn of the century. But even with this, Hirschfeld subscribed to some parts of eugenic theory and the genetics of degeneracy, and most writing of his day, including his own, demanded respectability politic in order for LGBTQ people to exist in a public sphere. One must dress and act in a way that is expected of respectable or upstanding moral citizens in order to gain access to public spaces. This left out a large group of people, including the poor and sex workers from his movement. While it is important to uphold the work people like Hirschfeld did, it's also important to remember that they too were very imperfect. World War I was a part of what drove Hirschfeld's advocacy. It would be pushed forward thanks to a letter sent to the Scientific Humanitarian Committee by the partner of a gay soldier who had died in 1915 in Russia. The soldier, whose name has been lost, had been hit by shrapnel, one of his legs badly mangled. He wrote home to his partner, known only as S, over the last few weeks of his life. Though S received the letters, he learned that every reply he wrote was lost in the post and his partner never heard from him. S was not alone, and gay veterans organizations would add to the voice of the gay rights movement in Germany. Unlike Hirschfeld, they did not approach their advocacy scientifically, rather with the same voice that rights movements in the United States would use throughout the 20th century. "We are upstanding citizens. We deserve equal treatment." Or, as S wrote in his letter to the Scientific Humanitarian Committee, "People who are by nature oriented toward the same sex do their duty. It is finally time that the state treated them like they treat the state." The voices of these men would serve to move public opinion a little, but Germany was no haven. Being out could still cost someone their job, their home, their friends, and family. And as long as paragraph 175 was still law, could land them in prison. I should also take a moment to note that it is at this time that the German government shifts from a monarchy to a representative democracy, thanks to the outcome of the war. It also signals the start of the economic hardships that fascists would use to gain control of the nation in the years that follow. In 1919, Hirschfeld, along with a few others, founded the Institute for Sexual Science in Berlin. When the then popular form of entertainment, the human zoo, would travel to the city, Hirschfeld would meet with the people on display and, through translators, ask them questions about families and relationships in their own communities. He firmly believed that the ideology of Judeo-Christian civilizations, including his own, was a serious impediment to understanding human sexuality and to the reform of laws that had been put in place to condemn and regulate it. His most influential idea was quite possibly the concept of sexual intermediaries. According to Britannica.com, quote, which held that there were many types of naturally occurring sexual variations found across the human population, such as hermaphroditism, homosexuality, and transvestism. He is also credited with coining the term transvestite, end quote. Hirschfeld's commentaries also examine the other areas of prejudice. It was he who first used the word racism, coining it specifically to describe Nazi ideologies and centering racial hatred as the cornerstone of their beliefs. The Institute is also credited with being one of the first medical facilities in the world with the capability to perform gender affirmation surgeries. However, all documentation of those procedures was destroyed in May of 1933. We no longer have any documentation of what surgeries were performed or how. What we do have, though, are some of the stories of the people who had their gender affirmed at the Institute. And it is at this building that Christopher Isherwood would stay when he was in Berlin. The ideas and experiences here a major influence on his novel Goodbye to Berlin, on which the musical Cabaret is based. As an aside, while this is all taking place in Germany, the impact of these people and these organizations reached far farther afield. Hirschfeld himself spent 6 weeks in New York City in 1930 and was titled The Einstein of Sex, giving lectures, meeting with advocates, and studying the lifestyles of others. His time in the United States was part of a world trip to Japan, China, the Philippines, Indonesia, Singapore, Ceylon, India, Egypt, and the then British Mandate Palestine, on which he studied human sexuality, believing, quote, there are not two populations and two lands and two populations with a complete match of sexual characteristics, end quote. His work would later lead to movements in other nations, including the United States. Hirschfeld's story really deserves a lot more time, given how instrumental he and the work of others in Germany was toward the start of these movements in other places. But instead, let this overview be that which piques your curiosity. Hirschfeld's life did take a turn for the worse, though, as time went forward. Regularly assaulted throughout the 1920s and his lectures disrupted, it is no surprise a gay Jewish man would become a target for Nazi persecution. And in 1921, he was beaten in the street in Munich after giving a public lecture. His injuries were so severe, onlookers assumed he was dead. Hirschfeld read his own obituary a few days later while riding the train from Munich to Berlin. The laws he sought to erase were slated for a vote for repeal in 1929, but concentration of power by the Nazis ended the effort and the law stayed. In 1932, after completing a successful speaking tour of Europe, Hirschfeld was refused re-entry to Germany and went to Switzerland instead. Hirschfeld's colleague, Kurt Hiller, who had taken over as chairman of the Scientific Humanitarian Committee in 1929, was arrested by the Gestapo in March of 1933. Hiller was another gay German Jewish man. He was sent to Oranienburg concentration camp, established earlier that year when the Nazi Party took power, until August of 33. According to the Jewish Telegraph Agency archives, he was beaten with steel rods and later rearrested. He fled to Prague in 1934 and later left there for London. He did return to Germany in 1955 and lived there until his death in 1972. Back in 1933, though, on May 6th, the Nazi youth marched on and raided the Institute, destroyed the property, and carted off 20,000 books that would be burned in the streets at the massive May 10th book burnings across Germany. A series of events carefully orchestrated by Joseph Goebbels, Nazi Minister for Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. Goebbels himself spoke at these burnings, calling on the assembled in Berlin to, quote, no to decadence and moral corruption, yes to decency and morality in family and the state, end quote. All of Hirschfeld's groundbreaking research on homosexuality and cultures across the globe was gone. It is still considered a devastating loss of research in this area, and some of what Hirschfeld collected about indigenous colonized cultures may not be rediscovered. He moved to France in 1934 and died there the following year. The same year of Hirschfeld's death, the Nazis expanded the powers of paragraph 175, against which he had fought so hard, to include prosecution for any homosexual act, including those which required no physical contact. Even suggestive glances could be grounds for suspicion. This was the foundation for the exterminations that would follow. I want to encourage a moment of observation in this photograph. It and others from the destruction of Hirschfeld's Institute were released by the Nazis to demonize the Institute for Sexual Science. The staging of this photo makes sure the viewer knows who is in charge. The image is prominently placed as a demonstration of the kinds of material being seized. This was a vile place, they wanted to say, and look at all the horrible pornographic material we are destroying to preserve the moral soul of Germany. What happened there was a clear indication of the intents of the Reich to destroy the LGBTQ community. Initial dehumanization, disempowerment through destruction of community knowledge, escalating rhetoric about the danger of these people to the fabric of the nation, and eventually lists of individuals to be arrested. In 1924 in the United States, Hirschfeld's work inspired Henry Gerber to found the Society for Human Rights in Chicago after he visited Germany. His home was raided and the police strong-armed the organization into shutting down after only a few months. But at least in the US, we see those seeds planted by Hirschfeld's ideas starting to sprout. And things were changing in another corner of the United States as well, in New York. The Harlem Renaissance was described by scholar Henry Louis Gates as having been, quote, surely as gay as it was Black, not that it was exclusively either of these, end quote. While most of the highly influential individuals of the time who were gay, lesbian, or bisexual wouldn't reveal this outside of Harlem, there were circles within the community where people, especially the cultural elite, did relax. One such example of the appearance of lesbian and gay themes in literary work comes from Langston Hughes's poem Cafe 3 a.m. Detectives from the Vice Squad with weary sadistic eyes spotting fairies, degenerates, some folks say. But God, nature, or somebody made them that way. Police lady or lesbian over there? Where? To step aside on a specific aspect of Harlem culture for a moment, I want to point out that in this place, drag balls began in 1869 within Hamilton Lodge. But by the 20s, by the time of the Harlem Renaissance, Harlem drag balls could attract thousands of visitors who were multiracial, multi-ethnic, and cross-class lines. Langston Hughes titled his essay describing these events, Spectacles of Color. He says, quote, strangest and gaudiest of all Harlem spectacles in the 20s, and still the strangest and gaudiest, is the annual Hamilton Club Lodge Ball at Rockland Palace Casino. I once attended as a guest of Alelia Walker. It is the ball where men dress as women and women dress as men. During the height of the New Negro era and the tourist invasion of Harlem, it was fashionable for the intelligentsia and social leaders of both Harlem and the downtown area to occupy boxes at this ball and look down from above at the queerly assorted throng on the dancing floor, males in flowing gowns and feathered headdresses, and females in tuxedos and boxed back suits, end quote. While culture shifted and changed throughout time, these heavily attended events turning from a costume parade with first, second, and third prizes accompanied by a big dance party to the house balls of the present, where dedicated teams of performers enter into intense and glamorous competition. This subculture has influenced our language as well. If you've ever described something as fierce, mentioned throwing shade, or asked someone to sit back and spill the tea with you, you've used language originating in a subset of the LGBTQ community defined primarily by Black and Latinx youth, a subset that has its roots in the 1860s and bloomed into something uniquely exuberant in the 20s in Harlem, and then has come to flourish in its current form in about the past 40 or 50 years. While most definitely not typical representation, the Black artistic elites during the Harlem Renaissance at least tolerated lesbian, gay, and bisexual individuals amongst them. From Bessie Smith, Gladys Bentley, and Ma Rainey to Alice Dunbar Nelson, Nella Larson, Langston Hughes, and County Cullen, sexual minorities were present and visible in Harlem, even if their sexuality was an open secret. American culture as a whole did loosen, though, during the Jazz Age with regards to homosexuality, and much of that was thanks to the immense popularity of drag balls and what was known as the pansy craze and sapphic craze. Mainstream America might not have approved of LGBTQ people in daily life, as evidenced by the anti-sodomy laws many states strictly enforced, but they embraced parties that put one subset of the community on lavish display and the aesthetic stereotyped by effeminate gay men and masculine lesbians. So this did lead to those stereotypes and characters then showing up in popular media, from books to music and even film. But The Hays Code, the law that enshrined decency into film, would put an end to that visible, even if highly stereotyped representation in 1934. Throughout the 1930s and 40s, laws in other parts of the world continued to loosen a little. Uruguay, Switzerland, Sweden, Suriname all joined the countries where at least it wasn't a crime to be gay. Again, though, this does not mean that these countries were becoming any kind of accepting, just that the laws were changing. Now, we cannot, however, gloss at all over what happened to the LGBTQ community in Nazi-occupied territories during the 1940s. Numbers vary, but it's estimated that 100,000 men were arrested between 1933 and 1945 under paragraph 175. Half of those were charged. Most served time in regular prisons, but somewhere around 10,000 men were sent to the concentration camps, primarily Mauthausen, for being gay, and the majority of them did die. This is where the pink triangle was first associated with the community, particularly gay men. The image on this slide is from Sachsenhausen, which was established in 1936 as the replacement for Oranienburg, closed in 34. That's the one that Kurt Hiller had been sent to. The pink triangle pointed down, the symbol of these places of this brutality, was reclaimed as a symbol of resistance in, I believe, the 1970s to those that would seek to continue that genocide, whether either literally or metaphorically. The black triangle was used for general sexual or moral degeneracy, and if women were to be jailed because they were lesbians or for some form of sexual indecency, they would be given that color triangle. That would be their imprisoned color. Both symbols were later reclaimed by these groups. The black triangle also was reclaimed by some lesbian groups as a form of empowerment. The pink triangle became the most widely visible of them thanks to the work of activists during the AIDS crisis. Now, many of the gay men who were liberated from concentration camps were then again sent to prison after they were freed to finish their sentence under the still standing paragraph 175. That they would not be recognized as a Nazi persecuted group until 1985, and there would be no memorial to either gay Holocaust victims or those who were charged under paragraph 175 until the 1990s. As per the law, East Germany abolished the Nazi amendments to it, those ones that expanded the powers of paragraph 175, in 1950, but West Germany kept those and confirmed them in constitutional court. Between 1945 and 1969, 100,000 men were implicated and half were convicted. While the law was loosened in 1969 in West Germany to allow for an age of consent at 21 and then lowered to 18 in 1973, it wasn't until 1994 that the paragraph was finally repealed in West Germany and the age of consent for homosexual sexual relationships brought in line with that of heterosexual relationships. East Germany, on the other hand, had reformed their version of the paragraph in 1968 and repealed it entirely in 1988. It was not until 2017 that Germany's parliament voted for financial restitution and expungement of the criminal records of those convicted under paragraph 175. And while Germany was maintaining its laws against LGBTQ individuals, particularly gay men, other areas in Europe were also enforcing oppression. In 1952, Great Britain convicted Alan Turing, one of the men instrumental in cracking the Nazi Enigma encryption at the top secret Bletchley Park facility, for homosexual offenses. He was one of many. After 2 years of advocacy by Manchester Minister of Parliament John Leach, Queen Elizabeth II signed a posthumous pardon for Turing in December of 2013 and pronounced him pardoned in August 2014. Before the pardon, though, was officially proclaimed, human rights advocates were already questioning why only Turing should be granted this right, given there were thousands of others convicted under those same indecency laws. And it was 2017, the same year as Germany, before Great Britain passed a law that retroactively pardoned the men with criminal records stemming from historical legislation outlawing homosexual acts. But the 1950s weren't entirely bleak. In 1950, Harry Hay and others formed the Mattachine Society in Los Angeles. Hay would be ousted just after a few years due to his membership in the Communist Party, but the organization continued on. Hay was instrumental in the gay rights movement and documented the history of the community. Tensions are building in the United States, and the law starts to slowly open up a little. In 1958, the Supreme Court ruled that homosexual publications didn't inherently violate obscenity laws just because they featured homosexual themes, and that's actually quite a big deal at this point. And it's against this backdrop that we see one of our first major movements of resistance in 1959. There was this little shop, Cooper's Donuts, situated in between bars on Main Street in an area of downtown Los Angeles that was called at that time the gay ghetto, where many people who didn't fit the mold lived openly and were routinely harassed by law enforcement or arrested for their visibility. LAPD had a reputation well into the 80s for particularly targeting the LGBTQ community. Now, during the day, Cooper's was popular with police officers, and evenings attracted patrons who weren't always welcome. Transgender women or drag queens, gay men who were cruising, or that means out looking for sex, and sex workers. If you think this is the perfect setup for calamity, you wouldn't be wrong. One May day, and historians aren't actually sure of the date, one of the ever so common raids on Cooper's took place. These were common enough that a raid during the day wouldn't stop patrons from returning later. The following day after this raid, police came in and arrested 2 sex workers, 1 young gay man out cruising, and 2 transgender women or drag queens. The terms vary depending on who's telling the story, and at the time they were just being called drag queens. We don't really know how they would have identified today. But the police tried to put all 5 of these people in the back of 1 squad car. To massively understate the issue, this was not received well. One of the people being arrested fought back and inspired the other 4 to do the same. Others in the donut shop took notice and began throwing things at police, pelting them with coffee cups, rubbish, paper plates, and yes, donuts, to protest the brutality and harassment to which their community was regularly subjected. There were no completed arrests that night. Police fled to their cars, and fed up uprising participants started rocking the cars before the police could drive away. By the time they returned, the ensuing riot shut down the street for a day. While this is considered the first of the rebellions, John Recchi, one of those the police attempted to arrest that night, considers anyone within the LGBTQ community living openly at that time to have been living in rebellion every day of their lives. To quote him, many at the time risking years of imprisonment, end quote, as not only was dressing outside the gender norms illegal, but so was homosexuality. Though the rebellion at Cooper's Donuts didn't have much of an impact on the national or local landscape and wasn't well photographed or documented, it was one of the signs the community was at a breaking point. Now, of course, change is still slow. Even after this, the first state to abolish their anti-sodomy laws did so in 1962. That was Illinois. Go Illinois. We see the formation of the first gay liberation group in the United States, though, in 1965, the Vanguard, in the Tenderloin district of San Francisco. This group was formed by poor young people who were tired and ready to push back. And it is in that same part of San Francisco where we find another hotspot for sex workers, gay men out cruising, and transgender people or drag queens. Compton's Cafeteria was a popular after-hours location in 1966, and like Cooper's Donuts, the police could be guaranteed a successful night of stamping out indecency if they came to Compton's, and clashes with the police were not uncommon. Now, there are a few stories about how the Compton's Cafeteria uprising started, but it began with some kind of protest over increasingly hostile and discriminatory service at the cafe. After police were called, officers attempted to arrest a drag queen or transgender woman. Again, we don't know which term would fit better according to today's standards. Well, she wasn't going to go quietly. She threw her coffee in the officer's face. Once again, the powder ignited. The cafeteria erupted. Furniture was overturned. People threw the sugar shakers through the window. Women used their purses as weapons against law enforcement, and dozens of people gathered outside and started to fight the police. The windows were smashed out of at least 1 squad car, and a nearby newsstand burned to the ground. Immediately after, transgender women and drag queens were banned from restaurants. No one wanted to risk a raid on their business, leading to a riot. This was not received well and led to a second night of unrest. The repaired windows of the cafe once again shattered. But the interesting thing about Compton's, though, is that San Francisco took notice of the uprising as a reaction of a marginalized people in need of some sort of change. So instead of continuing to lock gender and sexuality minorities out of society, the city started to develop a network of support services that eventually led to the creation of the National Transsexual Counseling Unit in 1968, an organization which included mental health, medical, and social services. But it wouldn't be until 1974 that San Francisco completely repealed their cross-dressing laws. Throughout the 60s, there were several other actions taken to try to convince the majority that gender and sexuality minorities were deserving of equal treatment and access to society. Picket lines were popular tactics for certain rights organizations in what was called the homophile movement. The Mattachine Society, if you remember, was formed back in 1950, and their lesbian counterparts, the Daughters of Bilitis, were some of the largest of these organizations and regularly set up picket lines to show that LGBTQ community members were respectable and employable. Some groups also organized lunch counter sit-ins to protest denial of service to gender and sexuality minority individuals. Regardless of which actions these particular groups took, Women at their events were expected to wear skirts and men to wear shirts and ties, and everyone had to show up on their best behavior to convince those around them that they were worthy of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They had to look respectable. So I'm going to pause here for a moment to acknowledge that this is part of the big distinction between a rights movement and a liberation movement. Rights movements ask for access to existing power structures and need to make themselves palatable in order for those in power to give them that support. It's about gaining access. Liberation movements, on the other hand, opt out of respectability politics, instead seeking to dismantle those existing structures of oppression and replace them with a more equitable process. Liberation movements also sometimes tend to turn inward, creating mutual aid networks and community care that doesn't depend on dominant structures. One group that particularly exemplifies this is if you look at how the Black Panthers functioned in Oakland when they first formed, creating lunch programs for children and other social services within their own community. That is an example of a liberation movement. Queer liberation movements aren't just marked by uprisings, but those do tend to be the moments during which they become the most visible, even though their organizations are often working behind the scenes long before those moments explode into mainstream visibility. Now I'm going to touch on two other actions that took place in Los Angeles between Compton's and Stonewall. The first of these happened on New Year's Eve in 1966. The glittering party at the Black Cat Tavern was full underway when undercover police who had infiltrated early in the evening arrested two patrons for kissing on New Year's Eve when the ball dropped. People objected to this, and in response, officers started beating several patrons, and 14 more people were arrested for assault and public lewdness. That didn't lead to a riot, but it did lead to a civil demonstration on February 11, 1967, of somewhere between 300 and 600 people, depending on who you ask. That did not stop 6 of the 14 people being arrested from being convicted and registered as sex offenders for the rest of their lives. It was the first time, though, in legal history that the gay men who were on trial asserted they were equals to heterosexuals under the Constitution. If straight people could kiss in public, so could they. They didn't win their cases, and their appeals, which did reach up to the US Supreme Court, were refused to be heard. But the actions of the officers and the resulting demonstration did not go unnoticed and would lead to one of the local gay rights organizations changing the name of their newsletter. It became Pride, as in an acronym, PRIDE, Advocate, which would then evolve into The Advocate, which is still a well-known source of news for the LGBTQ community. The Black Cat did eventually reopen as a pub in 2012. It had been a few different things in between the 60s and then, after having been designated a Los Angeles historical cultural landmark in 2008. Now, of course, the Black Cat Tavern wasn't the only one of many bars raided by the police at this time. Another one that's significant in 1968 is The Patch, another Los Angeles bar. The bar had been under the eye of the police for a while. The owner, a comedian known as Lee Glaze, had been warned that in order to stay in business, he had to prohibit drag acts, stop physical contact, and keep men from dancing with each other, amongst other restrictions. He initially tried to meet these restrictions, but he lost patrons. So instead of complying, he would play God Save the Queen on the jukebox to warn his guests when undercover officers were in the bar so that they would know to behave. This didn't stop the Vice Squad from bursting in August with 6 other LAPD officers. They demanded IDs and arrested people for no reason. Lee was livid. He leapt on the stage and called for action, getting patrons to start chanting, "Fight for your rights, and we are Americans too." He promised to bail out those arrested and to pay attorney's fees as a raid turned into a protest. It didn't end there, though. Lee led his patrons to a flower shop nearby and bought out most of the shop, excluding pansies, and gave the blooms to his fellow protesters and led them on a flower power march to the nearby police station. They stayed until all those arrested had made bail and were released. Bar raids and police brutality were just part of the everyday reality of LGBTQ people at this time, with some departments like LAPD being more notorious than others. Meanwhile, just above our northern border here in 1969, Pierre Trudeau told the Interior of Canada, quote, "The state has no place in the bedrooms of the nation," end quote, and struck down Canada's own prohibitions on homosexuality. Canada launched an expungement program in June of 2018 with financial compensation for those with military or federal careers damaged due to prosecution based on sexual orientation. Now, we have arrived in 69 and to the most widely known of the uprisings by the LGBTQ community. That June, New York's gender and sexuality minority community erupted at the Stonewall Inn on Christopher Street in the East Village. The Stonewall Inn was, like so many gay bars, particularly in New York, run by the mafia and wasn't exactly an above-board establishment. It had no liquor license, no running water for dishwashing, toilets that were frequently non-functional, and no fire exit. Raids here were just a part of life, but there was some protection from being in a mafia-run establishment. The story goes that the raid went as most of them did. Police ushering people out of the bar, manhandling some, dragging out others, and as usual, not everyone went quietly. It is said that Stormy de la Verre, a biracial lesbian drag king and jazz singer, complained that her handcuffs were hurting her, and because of this, the police started beating her. The crowd outside of the bar heard her yell something to the effect of, "Why don't you people do something?" Legend says this is the spark that ignited the riot. Miss Major Griffin Gracie, a Black transgender woman, was at the bar with friends on June 27th when the bar was raided and was one of the leaders of the riot that began in the very early hours of June 28th. She doesn't remember a dramatic start to the riot by her description. "All I know is that all of a sudden you were fighting for your effing existence," she says. Thanks to other arrests, she'd learned that it was better to have the police knock you out than to keep fighting so they'd keep beating you. So she snatched the mask off of an officer's head and spit in his face. She says, quote, "He knocked my ass out. That's the last thing I remember. When I woke up, I was in the tombs, and the next day they just let us all out," end quote. These excerpts are from an excellent interview with her in the San Francisco Weekly in 2015. Miss Major is still alive and one of the few from those early days who is, and she is still fighting to protect her community, whether she's helping transgender youth stay off the streets or attending Black Lives Matter protests. I want to emphasize what happened here. People were beaten bloody, property destroyed, police cars had their tires slashed, windows smashed out. It was street fighting against a police department that had harassed and brutalized the people in the bar with legal authority to do so for years. Police barricaded themselves in the inn once it was emptied from patrons. A parking meter was used as a battering ram to try to break down the doors to get to them. It was not a pretty demonstration or a peaceful one, and it lasted days, 28th of June to the 3rd of July, 1969. When we say Pride was a riot, that's not an exaggeration. We mean exactly that. Marsha P. Johnson, Sylvia Rivera, and Miss Major and others literally fought towards liberation. Stonewall was driven by transgender women of color who until recently were largely erased from that history. People who were fed up and tired and knew they weren't being heard. Now in 1970, the Christopher Street Liberation Day Parade would step off on the anniversary of the riots, and several of those who had been involved would attend. Multiple gay rights and queer liberation groups met to discuss the need for a commemorative event, only a short time after the riot had ended. The march was proposed by Brenda Howard, who is sometimes referred to as the mother of Pride, and oftentimes in accounts labeled as a straight woman, but this is not true either. She was a bisexual woman married to a man. She founded the New York Bisexual Network and promoted acceptance of and awareness of kink and polyamorous communities as well. But she too has often been sanitized to be uncontroversial and palatable. Her passion for supporting sexual liberation and safe, sane, and consensual sex education led to Pride being a week of workshops and celebrations instead of just one day with a march. That first march route was 51 blocks from Christopher Street to Central Park. At one point, the march consisted of thousands of marchers and spanned about 15 blocks, filling the street. They were as enthusiastic as well as nervous, and their energy made the march last only half the time organizers had initially anticipated them taking. So, another cascade of countries and events here in the 70s. We're going to do another whirlwind pass through. The countries that decriminalized in 1970s, we have Austria, Costa Rica, and Finland moving forward. California and Oregon repealed their anti-sodomy laws for good. Iowa repealed them, but then the outrage brought forth by angry Mormon and Catholic organizations brought them back shortly after. Sensing the turning of history, the U.S. Libertarian Party called out for the repeal of all victimless crime laws, including anti-sodomy laws in 1971. And ever on the forefront, University of Michigan established the nation's first collegiate LGBT programming office the same year. Looking through timeline from the 70s, everything really snowballs. In 1972, Sweden becomes the first nation to allow for legal sex changes and free hormone therapies. 72 is a big year in the United States too. East Lansing, Michigan, Ann Arbor, Michigan, and San Francisco, California are the first cities in the nation to pass homosexual rights ordinances. Ann Arbor also elects the first person who will come out while serving in a public office, and will 2 years later, I believe by re-electing that individual, elects the first openly gay American to public office. The Democratic National Convention sees their first gay and lesbian delegates advocate for a gay rights plank in the party platform. And in San Francisco, Twin Peaks Tavern removes their blacked out windows and becomes the first gay bar in the city to have clear glass windows. With all this momentum comes the announcement in 1973, homosexuality is not a mental illness, first declared by the Australian and New Zealand College of Psychiatry Federal Council in October, followed by the American Psychological Association in December. In 1974, Chile joined Sweden in allowing for the change in sex designation on legal documentation after medical transition. Panama joins them in this allowance in 75. As an aside, the United States still does not have a national law allowing for the affirmation of one's gender on legal documents, and what can be changed and under what circumstances varies widely from state to state. Some require documentation from medical professionals, while others allow for no changes at all. But at least in Minneapolis in 1974, they understood passing transgender inclusive civil rights protections legislation was the thing to do, and they were the first city in the country to do so. Boulder County, Colorado also took a radical step of issuing 6 same-sex marriage licenses in that year. They were all overturned, but someone in that county recognized there was no reason not to move this forward. And in 1977, Quebec was the first jurisdiction larger than a city to prohibit discrimination based on sexual orientation in both the public and private sector. While many countries were still decriminalizing sexual practices between same-sex partners, they hadn't done anything to actually protect anyone from persecution until Quebec did that, 8 years after Canada's declaration that the state should stay out of people's bedrooms. Harvey Milk told people that we have to keep giving them hope in that same year of 77 and was elected city supervisor of San Francisco. Milk was more than just a politician, though. Openly gay, openly unapologetic, and an advocate for full acceptance, he was a symbol of what people could be and do if only they had the means to. During his 11 months in office, he sponsored a bill to ban discrimination from public accommodation, housing, and employment, which passed 11-1 and was signed into law by Mayor George Muskegon. November 27, 1978, though, both Milk and Muskegon were shot in City Hall by former city supervisor Dan White. Milk's body was found by Dianne Feinstein, who would then step into Muskegon's role as mayor. White stood trial in May of 79, and the jury reached a verdict of guilty of voluntary manslaughter. His legal team argued he'd been out of his mind with intense depression, a bout of temporary insanity when he shot both men. He couldn't have premeditated it. With good behavior, he would serve possibly only 5 years. The public, however, wasn't buying it. White had stopped to reload mid-massacre, indicating he had at least thought far enough ahead to bring more bullets. The news spread and the gay community descended on City Hall. Inside, Mayor Feinstein took time to absorb the news of White's sentencing before she went home with her fiance, Richard Bloom, at 6 p.m. for supper. It wasn't long before she was notified of unrest at City Center, and at 8:30, when she and Bloom returned to City Hall, the White Night riots had begun. Thousands of protesters were gathered, some smashing the building. People were screaming for White's death. The police went in with clubs and things just escalated farther. After they started beating people, police cars went up in flames. Things calmed down after a few hours, but at that point, a group of police officers decided that retaliation was in order and descended on the Castro. They went to the Elephant Walk, a gay bar, and began destroying the property and assaulting patrons. It took the arrival of the police chief to stop it. Dozens of officers and over 100 civilians were injured over the course of the night. A civil grand jury would later convene and find that there was insufficient evidence to indict anyone for the riots. At a press conference the day after the riots, Supervisor Harry Britt spoke and said, "Harvey Milk's people do not have anything to apologize for. Now the society is going to have to deal with us, not as nice little fairies who have hairdressing salons, but as people capable of violence. We are not going to put up with Dan Whites anymore." Of course, the 1980s then is marked largely by the AIDS crisis. The epidemic began with the appearance of a rare skin cancer, Kaposi sarcoma, and were opportunistic pneumonias in young gay men in San Francisco. By the time the disease had a name, people were dying an incredibly short time after diagnosis. Initially called GRID, gay-related immune disease, this disease caused panic among the LGBTQ community and fear in the medical community alike, especially before it was known how it was transmitted. Because people admitted to the hospital dying of AIDS were quarantined, it became pretty clear that in the beginning, those who were infected were going to die alone. In addition to these fears, the familial and societal rejection of those with AIDS was incredibly common. The LGBTQ community would have to take care of each other, and they tried. They created mutual aid networks. People sat with those who were dying. They pooled their money to have wills written. They agitated to keep bereaved partners in their homes, even when they weren't on the lease. And they made sure that people had the basics, and even sometimes dug graves for the deceased if no one else would. But on the government end, nothing was improving and people were dying. And in 1987, well-known activist Larry Kramer gathered with around 300 other people in a community center in Lower Manhattan to found ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. ACT UP would become a driving force in activism within the LGBTQ community. Now, during this time, CDC Director James Mason said, "There are certain areas which, when the goals of science collide with moral and ethical judgment, science has to take a timeout." The Reagan administration wasn't really interested in advocating for those with AIDS. This government inaction has led some activists to call the AIDS crisis a genocide. Amidst the AIDS crisis, the Supreme Court of the United States heard the case Bowers versus Hartwick in 1986. The case questioned the legality of Georgia's anti-sodomy law, which forbade oral and anal sex between consenting adults. This is one of many state anti-sodomy laws that were still in the books at this point. The law was upheld by the court, establishing that the right to privacy did not extend to these acts, though whether the law could be applied and enforced wasn't clearly defined. Some states shed their discriminatory laws, but some of them were very determined to keep them. 2 years after Bowers v. Hardwick was decided, in 1988, the European High Court on Human Rights would rule the exact opposite, striking down an Irish law criminalizing male-to-male sex on the very grounds that these acts are covered by a right to privacy. That same year, 1988, ACT UP took on the Federal Drug Administration in October on an action they called Seize the FDA. The existing drug, AZT, wasn't enough to treat AIDS, and the side effects were terrible. Many people couldn't take it. They called news outlets and ACT UP called news outlets and gathered outside of the FDA offices in Bethesda, Maryland. They demanded an accelerated drug approval process for life-saving drugs during the epidemic and access to newer, cheaper, and more easily tolerated AIDS treatments that were being developed elsewhere. When officials met with the protesters, they found that ACT UP had a 40-page document outlining their demands, their research, and their reasoning. While not just the result of this action, the work of activists during the AIDS crisis brought forth an accelerated drug testing and approval process that would pave the way for the emergency authorization procedure that is currently being used to move forward vaccines for COVID-19. The urgency of one pandemic brought us the tools to fight another. Despite all these actions and activism, people, of course, were still dying. Activists confronted politicians, religious leaders, and leadership at the CDC and FDA. They were often abrasive and sometimes intentionally offensive. One offshoot of ACT UP, the Treatment Action Group, took on the role of being medical and research advocates, working with various scientists and drug companies to find ways to treat AIDS. Some of the drugs worked, some of them didn't. During this, some of those with AIDS wanted to make sure that they left During this, some of those with AIDS wanted those they left behind to make their deaths mean something. Some asked for political funerals, which was when their coffins and eulogies were brought to the steps of institutions that they deemed responsible for their deaths. And some people took up sewing and made squares for a quilt that would first grace the National Mall in 1987 when it represented 1,920 people and was larger than a football field. Each panel is 3 foot by 6 foot, the size of a common grave. The last time it was displayed in its entirety, though, was in October of 1996. And at that time, it covered the entire National Mall. At present, the quilt, only ever displayed in sections, weighs 54 tons and includes more than 48,000 panels dedicated to over 100,000 people. And those who have lost loved ones to AIDS are still invited to add to it. Now, of all these big actions during the AIDS crisis, and there are a lot of them, there are a lot of very significant ones. One that really stands out to me very powerfully is the Ashes Action, which took place alongside the display of the AIDS quilt in October of 92 and then was reprised in 96. During this, people linked arms and made their way to the White House lawn where they poured the ashes of their deceased loved ones taken by AIDS over the fence of the White House to remind that inaction from the top was what led to the deaths of so many. I'm going to play a clip, which is from an episode of AIDS Community Television produced by ACT UP member James Wency, and he was part of what was called the Diva TV Collective. Diva stood for Damned Interfering Video Activists. I'm going to play it for you because I think that it captures really the anger and the pain and determination of the crisis and the activists who were really working towards everything with literally their last energies. Some of these people knew that they were dying while they were doing this activism. And if those people weren't actively dying, they were watching their friends do it. So this was an urgency that I really can't convey other than by showing.
Bringing the dead to your door. We won't take it anymore. Bringing the dead to your door.
We are taking our loved ones to scatter on the White House lawn. This is an angry funeral, not a sad one. The quilt makes our dying look beautiful, but it's not beautiful. It's ugly, and we have to fight for our lives.
There have been many documentaries made on the AIDS crisis and the activism that happened. And if you'd like recommendations for those, I can most definitely do so when we conclude the slides during our conversation. And while medications and treatments have advanced, those living with HIV still have an incredible number of barriers that they face and discrimination and stigma around the disease. And this is one area in which we still have quite a bit of work left to do. But not everything is bleak about the 80s and 90s, just like not everything was bleak about the 50s. There were points of light in all of this. There were bright sparks. In addition to the incredible families that people built with their friends and fellow activists and their lovers, as they did these actions, as they made this progress, as they lived their lives, there were also social progresses happening, both here and abroad. We're going to go on a little bit of a whirlwind here toward the present near some landmark stuff. In 1989, Denmark made history by creating registered civil partnerships for same-sex couples, which conveyed all the rights of marriage except adoption, which was gained in 2010, that did not include the right of a church marriage. It is in 1990, the World Health Association declared homosexuality is not an illness. And AIDS became an issue that the White House had to address when activist Bob Bravsky, the gentleman in the previous video saying that the quilt makes dying look beautiful and it's not, when he confronted then Governor Bill Clinton during the campaign for the presidency, demanding to know what he would do, AIDS became a primary issue. Unfortunately, Rafsky died later that year, just a few months after his stinging eulogy for fellow activist Mark Lowe Fisher. Fisher made a request that his death should be a statement. He wanted a political funeral. And to quote Fisher, he had requested, "I want my death to be as strong a statement as my life continues to be. I want my own funeral to be fierce and defiant, to make the public statement that my death from AIDS is a form of political assassination. We are taking this action out of love and rage. Bury me furiously." When memorializing Fisher on the eve of the election, Rafsky spoke as a man running out of time. Two things from his short eulogy have stood out to me. One of them I'll read here, the other on a later slide. Rafsky laid the blame for Fisher's death directly on the inaction of President George Bush. And in his grief and fury, he said he cursed the then president to remember, quote, "In the moment of your defeat, you'll remember our defeats. And in the moment of your death, you'll remember our deaths," end quote. Bush was defeated in the election the following day. Now, I'm not one for superstitions, but this does stand out, not just because of that, but because President Bush died on the eve of World AIDS Day in 2018. Though Rafsky and so many others wouldn't live to see it, the American Medical Association declared that homosexuality wasn't an illness in 1994. Now, things weren't all rosy in the 90s. We all know that. In response to Hawaii's High Court questioning the compelling interest the state had in regulating marriage to just being between one man and one woman, the United States passed the Federal Defense of Marriage Act in 1996. A few states reaffirmed this, passing their own defense of marriage laws in 2002. Now in 2003, though, the United States, we see the landmark case Lawrence versus Texas come to the Supreme Court that declared anti-sodomy laws were unconstitutional. And it struck down laws that were still being enforced in 13 states. This overturned Bowers, that previous case decided in 86. Immediately thereafter, in 2004, a whole slew of states passed their own Defense of Marriage Acts. And while I believe that was the year most of them passed, in 2004, there were some which continued to crop up all the way through 2012, with North Carolina being the final to do so. So if you really think about it, 2003 being when Lawrence struck down anti-sodomy laws throughout the nation. Homosexuality has only really been truly decriminalized and legal in the United States for 18 years, and marriage gained for only a sliver of time. So many people fought to get where we are today, while their states could arrest them for what they chose to do in their own bedrooms. Being out was dangerous and illegal. There is no national program to expunge the records of those convicted under state laws before Lawrence, and people still live with those convictions on their records, despite the acts themselves no longer being illegal. Those states that do have their own expungement programs all have differing criteria for doing so and levels of privacy of those records after. The laws are still on the books, even though they're unconstitutional in a dozen states. And according to an article in LGBTQ Nation from September of 2019, Alabama, Florida, Idaho, Kansas, Louisiana, Michigan, Mississippi, North Carolina, Oklahoma, South Carolina, Texas, and Utah. Even Bayard Rustin, civil rights activist and organizer from the Freedom Rides, would live and die with a conviction under these laws on his record. He was pardoned February 5th, 2020, 32 years after his death. And it took us a while. And sometimes systemic equity still feels like it's quite a ways off. But that brings us to the present, where sometimes things to celebrate right now seem a little elusive, a time during which that another statement from Rafsky's eulogy for Fisher doesn't sound like something from the past. He said, "Let the whole earth hear us now. We beg, we pray, we demand that this epidemic ends, not just so that we may live, but so that Mark's soul may rest in peace. In anger and in grief, this fight is not over till all of us are safe." I look back at this span of history and I find so much inspiration and even joy. This history of action and activism reminds me that we stand on the shoulders of giants, and our daily lives are owed to people who were unashamedly themselves, often in the face of intense discrimination, and yet persisted, often joyfully. Queer joy is out there and here, surrounding our community whenever someone finds the words that describes them, comes out and finds support and fierce protection, falls in love, embraces and celebrates their sexuality or their asexuality, hears their beloved pronouns spoken out loud, expresses the beauty of their gender identity, finds affirmation in their home, workplace, family, blood or built, or dances to a song that seems written just for them in hundreds of daily occurrences, big or small, that uplift and allow for love and authenticity to shine and fuel everything we do to fight back. And I keep coming back to that line of Rafsky's, "This fight is not over till all of us are safe. We have been carried here by giants. Take care of yourselves, and thank you all." So that is what I have for you today, my friends. I have stopped the screen share so that I can see the chats. And thank you all for having been here. If you have questions, you are welcome to pitch them to me. I know that we are just skimming in right on the hour here, so. I
hope that's okay that I'm unmuting.
Oh yeah, definitely.
First off, it was a wonderful presentation. I loved it. But then I was wondering if you had any resources like books, documentaries, because I would like to do some further research.
I actually had a reference list at one point written up for this whole thing by hand,
awesome.
And I lost it. However, there is a document that I did put in the document share That
Okay.
is, I believe, titled LGBTQ History Resources, and that is one that I have started compiling stuff into. I consider it a living document, and I'm just going to keep pitching things in there as I find it. If you discover awesome things, my email's on there too. You're welcome to shoot something to me, and I can add it to that list. It's something I want, to collaboratively build. But there's a
Okay.
start there.
Awesome. Thank you.
If you're interested specifically in AIDS actions, the documentary How to Survive a Plague is stunning. It is a gut punch emotionally. It is very hard to watch, but it is worth it. United in Anger is another very, very beautiful one that covers it. That one's specifically the history of ACT UP. And if no one else has anything, that's fine. You can always shoot me a message. Hop over that historical references list in the resource share, and my email's there. You're welcome to send me a note. And I hope you all have a wonderful rest of the conference.